Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you what's going to end up being the first part of 3 of my June wrap-up. I participated in 3 different readathons over the course of June. This is going to be the wrap-up for the first one, the Sci-Fi Summer Readathon. The second wrap-up I'm going to do is going to be a combination of the things I read for the Because Dragons Readathon and the Getting Graphic Readathon. Those 2 readathons overlapped, and I overlapped books for the challenges of those as well. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to hit on some of the books that I read during the month that weren't for either of those readathons. There weren't that many of them, but there were a few. So Sci-Fi Summer ran for the first week of June. It's a readathon hosted over on the Seasons of Reading blog. I'll leave a link to that below so you can check it out for future readathons. I had, you may remember, 5 books on my TBR for that readathon. I only managed to get through 3 of them, even though they were really short books. The first 2 that I read were The Warren by Brian Evenson and The Revolving Boy by Gertrude Friedberg. These went really fast for me, and I read each of them in a day. I got these both done on the first 2 days of the readathon. And then I started reading Starship Troopers, and this just became such an utter slog for me, and I took the rest of the week to finish reading this book. So I think this wrap-up is in some ways going to reflect that reading experience for me. It's going to be pretty easy for me to talk about these 2 books, and then I'm gonna have to wrestle with this one a bit. So first, The Warren. This is one of the Tor.com novellas that I honestly would not have had any interest in, except that, as I mentioned when I hauled this, and again in my TBR, I ended up getting this copy as a freebie. It was an extra bonus that was added in the package, completely to my surprise, when I won a Goodreads giveaway for an advanced copy of Binti Home. So I didn't really know what to expect from this at all, but I thought I'd give it a try. It ended up being a decent sort of sci-fi thought experiment book. I like sci-fi that's a little twisty and mind-bendy. I like to be intellectually challenged by my science fiction. But in the end, this ended up just being like way too gruesome and bleak for me. This is about a character who lives in an underground habitat called the Warren. He's the last person left there after the people who created him have left. We gather that he comes from a long line of people who have created artificially somehow their successors in order to carry on surviving. And it seems that our main character is a repository for the stored memories of all of the people who have come before him, because the computer in which these people's memories have been stored is breaking down. So this is where it's like a bit of a mind bender, because as the book goes on, it's not entirely clear always exactly who the narrative voice is, even though they are all existing within the same person. So this concept, in essence, was interesting enough to me that this was kind of angling for a 3-star rating until the very end. And you know that I have some trouble with like really gruesome, bleak stuff. There was specifically one thing that happened towards the end of this book where I was just like, no, like I can't deal with that. I wish I could unsee that. Now that I've envisioned it, I wish I hadn't. And the ending of the story for me was also completely lacking in any sort of hope. So it wasn't my cup of tea, but it might be yours. It also seemed to me like it might be trying to like tap into the ideas of various sort of undead type of creatures, but in a sci-fi way. That wasn't expanded upon enough for me to be really sure if that was the intent. That's also something that doesn't really appeal to me. I don't like undead things. So I only ended up giving this 2 stars, but I'm not displeased that I read it because it was so short and it didn't take much time to read, and there were some things that were really interesting about how this story was told. The next book I read was an older sci-fi book. This is The Revolving Boy by Gertrude Friedberg. This is a book that I knew I had read as a kid, and I didn't think I remembered it at all. And it turned out I did. More on that later. But this was published in 1966. And it's very much an old sci-fi book. It's not something that you're necessarily going to go into if you're looking for something new and exciting from, today's sci-fi standard. It's more of an oddity of sci-fi past in terms of the setting and the science-y ideas. But on the other hand, the human element is that this is a story of a kid growing up with this exceptional ability and having to deal with that. And in that regard, I think it's still pretty compelling, and it was sort of a page-turner for me in terms of, the story of the main character. So this is mostly about the childhood of a young boy named Derv. As he grows up, as he becomes older, it becomes clear that he has an exceptional sense of direction, and that develops in an interesting way throughout his young life. There's a bit of mystery surrounding why he might have this sort of extraordinary capability. It turns out there's a big secret that his parents have been hiding from him all his life and that sort of thing. And we follow him from a very young age through till he's in high school. And it turns out that I thought I didn't remember this book at all from reading as a kid, but I remembered as I went, everything about Derv's personal, growing up story. I was really surprised at that. The sci-fi stuff surrounding it and the roles of the adults in the story, however, had completely disappeared from my memory. I didn't remember any of that at all. So I guess it's interesting to learn what our childhood brains remember of the stories that we read. But this is set in a future Earth that's basically, I think I calculated the years that this would be. It would have been the early 2000s through to now, the main chunk of this story. And then the last bit of the story jumps ahead several more decades. So obviously the future world that's envisioned here is out of date completely. It's one of these visions of tomorrow that are it doesn't have space travel, but there are flying cars and there are houses where the walls rearrange themselves when you want them to, but there aren't cell phones, and family dynamics and family structures still really strongly resemble, the 1960s when this was written. So that's what makes this book a little more of a vintage curiosity at this point than a serious sci-fi read. But then this was another book for me that was angling for a higher rating than it got until the very end. This was gonna be a 4-star rating for me, and then the resolution of this book, which I had forgotten all about, it ended up jumping several decades ahead in this character's life to the point where he's, a middle-aged man a whole long while later. And I get why I had forgotten about that. As a kid reading this, I just wasn't interested in that delayed gratification of the ending of the plot. I didn't care about Derv when he was my father's age anymore. And even reading this as an adult, where I was able to read sort of from the adult's perspective as well as from the kid's perspective, I kind of had the same reaction, because when you're following a character so closely through a portion of their life and you get emotionally invested in them, and then you lose that continuity, and by the time you meet them again, they feel like a totally different person. That ending, the culmination of that storyline, doesn't have the emotional payoff that I was looking for in this book. So that's why this got downgraded to a 3-star rating for me. This is still a book I would recommend. I'm not really sure who I would recommend this to specifically. Let me know if you're interested in reading this type of book. And then I spent the rest of the week of the Sci-Fi Summer Readathon reading Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein. And this is a classic of military science fiction. I don't really read military science fiction, so this was a stretch for me in that regard anyways. This was published in, I want to get you a publication date on all of the older books, 1959. And I see why this is a classic, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. In fact, I think part of the reason this might be a classic is just because it's so very confrontational in some ways. I really did not get along with a lot of the ideology that's presented in this book. And I'm guessing that part of the intent of this book is to get you to try and argue with it. And if you're arguing with a book like this, then you're engaged by it, and it's doing something to you. And if a sci-fi book is making you think, if only to try and formulate an argument against its ideas, then I think in some ways it's really doing its job. And that's why, as much as I despised this book, I did not give it 1 star. I gave it 2 stars, but I do rate for enjoyment, so I couldn't give it more than that. So what is this book about? This is about a young man named Johnny in a future society who joins the military straight out of school. It follows his military career through, a long period of boot camp training that's really intense, through some combat missions, then to a point where it looks like he'll be rising in the hierarchy of the military from there. So what this does on that level is it's a just life as a cog in the military machine type story. It throws you in as a sort of immersive look into that subject towards the beginning. Obviously, he's very much at the bottom of the totem pole and has to learn to live that life as someone at the bottom of the military totem pole, and then eventually he learns, as he rises in the military, he has to start thinking about what that responsibility means. And it goes on this way for quite a while before it really starts dropping any of the broader societal context for this story. What we eventually learn through flashbacks to this guy's moral philosophy courses in school is we learn that this is sort of portrayed as a utopian society in which the only people who are citizens who are allowed to vote are veterans. People who don't go in for military service, who decide to lead a civilian life, do not get to participate in the political process at all. And this is, on the whole, portrayed as a good thing. In addition, you start getting hints that this is a pretty harsh society in terms of you get all this sort of tough on crime ideology, which rubbed me the wrong way given the current political situation. But we start to get hints that are confirmed that this is a society where even in civilian society, the justice system involves corporeal punishment, death by hanging, for a lot of crimes. And eventually we get this sort of absurd backstory for how we got here as a society. And it turns out that in this book, the fall of democracy, the fall of those well-intentioned liberals and their democracy, was the fact that apparently parents didn't believe in spanking their kids anymore, so we got this entire generation of juvenile delinquents who didn't think there were going to be consequences for their actions, and so they tore society apart and the justice system couldn't handle them. And I just don't buy that at all, because I know for a fact that it is blatantly untrue that it's impossible to raise children with a strong moral compass without using corporeal punishment. You can raise law-abiding citizens without spanking them. Trust me, I know this. Another rationale that we get is that, back in the old days before the fall of democracy, morals had not yet been discovered to be an absolute science. And in this world, moral philosophy has been discovered to be, or at least decided upon, that it is an unquestionable absolute science. And we're told that we should understand that this post-democratic society is correct because it works, and therefore it cannot be questioned. And I'm sitting here hold up! I just read the 5th season. You cannot pull this nonsense on me. And I think a lot of these moral philosophy lectures are intended to be offensive. Like, you're supposed to take offense at this, and it's supposed to rattle you, and it did. And I don't know to what extent this is what Heinlein actually believed when he wrote this book, and to what extent it's a thought experiment, and it's trying to engage with the reader in this way. I've heard that this isn't the same ideology he necessarily proposes in all of his books, but the idea of like impressionable young readers, especially like teenage boys like the protagonist is at the start of this book, finding this without a ton of intellectual context and getting like really excited by the ideas in the book and not having the context for being able to analyze them, that scares me a bit. And I do think this book has some of that like appeal to teenage boys thing, where it focuses on this protagonist who is presented as essentially a mediocre student, no particular exceptional abilities, who through a really impulsive decision to join the military against his family's wishes, gets to a position where, yeah, he can be identified as one of the most exemplary examples of one of the only actual worthies, whereas all those intellectuals who want to think about society but not actually like fight for it, they're not actually worth anything. And I respect veterans as much as the next person, but I genuinely believe that there are other ways in life as well to demonstrate a willingness to put the greater good above one's own interests. And that sort of brings me to the subject of the war in this book. And the fact that the war itself is very explicitly not the focus, and the aliens that we are fighting are explicitly not the focus. The theory that's put forward here is that humanity must always strive to continue to exist, and that will necessarily always pit us against adversaries who also want to continue to exist. So there will always be war, and the exact details of that war don't matter. And you know what? That may actually be true. It's really bleak to think about, but that may be true. But it's not the angle of things that make me want to read sci-fi as a genre. When I'm reading books that have, interactions with alien species in them, for example, even if it's an envisioning of the world where war is inevitable, I want to know the specifics of, humans' interactions with this species and how we got into this war, and I want to know, I want to learn about the aliens. That's what's interesting about sci-fi for me. So as a sci-fi read, this was sort of really explicitly avoiding the things that I like reading in sci-fi, so it was disappointing to me just on that level. I think if you really like military stories that are about life in the military, this may appeal to you more than if you want intellectual sci-fi. I want intellectual sci-fi, and I'm not that interested in just on-the-ground military type stuff. And so I find that when push comes to shove, I can't particularly recommend this book. But having spent several weeks now cooling down from the experience enough to really think about it rationally, I'm not angry at this book like I was when I was reading it anymore. I'm glad that I've read it. I think I'm maybe a little wiser for having had to debate my way through it. But that's what I thought of Starship Troopers. I know there's a movie, and this is the movie tie-in edition, and I have not seen the movie. If you have, I'd be curious if that's the same approach that the movie takes. I'm not particularly interested in watching it, but I'd be curious to know how the movie deals with this source material. But basically, I did not like Starship Troopers. The end. So these were the 3 books out of 5 that I ended up reading for Sci-Fi Summer. Let me know if you've read any of them. Let me know if you have, what you think. Let me know if you're planning on reading any of them. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.